We've already seen the classic URL in a cold box application where you have the index.cfm file, your event parameter, which tells you which handler you're going to run, and then whatever other pieces of data you want to pass into your query string, you have those on the right side there after your event. We've also got the search engine safe URL version of that same thing. Here we've gotten rid of the question mark and the index.cfm syntax. Now we just have messages/list, which goes to the messages component, calls the list handler inside that CFC. And then we have our URL parameters after it, also passed in the search engine safe format. Year is set to 2020, month is set to 7, day is set to 26. And you can see we can output that information on the screen just like we expect to be able to. Let's take a look at another feature in the router CFC file called route placeholders. Here I have a new route, and it's going to eventually go to the messages.list handler, which is the same code we're running in those two browser windows that I just showed you. Notice here that the route starts off with /msgs, short for messages. Over here in the handlers folder, you can see we don't actually have a CFC called msgs. This is a shorthand syntax, meaning we're going to go from this route over to the messages.list event handler, and we're going to pass in 3 pieces of data, year, month, and day. They'll be put in that sequence, year first, then month, then day, and all 3 of those will be passed to the messages list handler. By doing this route placeholder syntax in our router CFC file, we can take the search engine safe URL like so, and shorten it even farther. Now I can just go to /msgs, put the year, month, and day parameters in there, and you can see we get the output on the screen just like we expect. Let's go back and take a look at our view so you can see how that works as well. Here's our handler, messages. There's the list function. You can see we're not doing anything in there at all, just passing the data straight from the RC scope into our view. And our view is simply outputting month, day, and year on the screen in the format that we want. So you can see using the route is the only thing we have to do to make this functionality work. You simply put route, whatever your route name is, your optional route placeholder syntax goes after that, and then tell it which event handler you're going to run. Again, nothing has to happen in your handler, and you can get to those RC variables that automatically get populated by that route right here in your view with no additional work. It does the exact same thing functionality-wise. There's no speed difference or security differences or anything like that. You simply can go from the longer traditional URLs to your search engine safe ones, and now you can get an even more concise URL using the route placeholders and the router CFC file. Let's take a look at that new route in a little bit more detail. We've got the shorthand syntax on the left-hand part that is basically an abbreviated version of our event handler. And then we have the 3 placeholders for the variables that are going to eventually become things in our RC scope. Notice how month and day both have question marks at the end of them. That means these 2 are optional placeholders. You don't have to pass in year and month and day. The route will work just fine even if you only pass in just year. It knows that the last 2 parameters are optional, and it works in that exact sequence. It'll be your abbreviated shorthand syntax here, then the required parameters, and then the optional items for your route that have the question marks at the end of them go at the end of that string. So we can pass in all 3 of these things in our URL like we just saw, or we can go to a browser and just pass in this case, the year and the month. Of course, when you do that, you have to actually specify a value for a default value for month and day, since those are optional. The route doesn't magically give you, say, a number to fill in for rc.day or rc.month. I still have to write some code somewhere to do that. But once I do that in my event handler, let's say, then the route will continue to work even if I don't pass in all 3 parameters. So in this case, what I would do is go to my messages.list, and I would just probably use the cf param tag to say anytime we don't have an rc.day value, just set it to the 1st of the month. Save that, reload our browser, and then you can see it defaults to July 1 because we passed in the year and the month. If I go up here and let's say we also forgot the month, then I get that same error saying key month doesn't exist. So in which case we would go back to our event handler, and I'd simply copy this line and give it a default value for rc.month. Let's say we'll set that to July just to mix it up and have two different numbers on the screen for our defaults, 7 and 1. There we go, and now you get July 1st as your default date, even though we only passed in the year. Now, of course, if I do pass in a month, I'll get August 1st, and if I pass in all three values, I'll get all three values being used instead of the defaults. That's how optional placeholders work in your routes. Let's take another look at that route we wrote earlier with the optional placeholders. Here it is on the screen. We've got our shorthand syntax for the event handler and then the three parameters after it. Notice month and day have the question marks at the end that notes them as optional. This one line of code takes the place of these three lines of code. If I didn't have the optional parameters available to me, I would have to explicitly write out a route that looks for all three year, month, and day being passed in, then another one that looks for year and month passed in, and a third route that looks for just year passed in. And I'd still also have to have my cfparam function calls here in the event handler to check for whichever of those items might be missing depending on which of my routes ran. But because we have optional placeholders available in our routes, I can replace those three lines of code with this one line of code here. And remember, if you do add changes like that into your router CFC, go back to your command box and do box reinit to make sure that your router CFC reloads so it will pick up those changes and you'll have your optional routes available in your application. There's no speed difference or other security benefits or anything like that using the optional routes. It just saves you lines of code, and it makes your route CFC files a little bit more concise. Less code means fewer things to deal with when you have bugs in your application. In this example, we've taken the route we had before for messages list and I've modified it a little bit. It still is looking for MSGS, and then we have placeholders here for year, month, and day. But notice that we've added this dash numeric syntax into each of those three placeholders. Now what we have is a numeric specific route in our application. It still has the same format when we go to the URL /MSGS/ and then things for year, month, and day. However, now we have a little bit of extra protection against those placeholders for year, month, and day being numeric or not. So if the user accidentally types in a value for year, month, or day that is not a numeric value, they're not going to actually get this route to load up. I'll go here to my browser and you can see what happens. So I'll go to /MSGS/ I'll give it a date 2020 to 11. And you can see we get the message on the screen, message for the date of February 11, 2020. Let's go up to the browser and I'll change, let's say, the year to something that is not numeric. And instead of getting me that messages list page, it bounces us to the home page. The reason it's doing that is right below this route, I've got basically the original version of that route. So /MSGS and then placeholders for year, month, and day. But notice how this one does not have the dash numeric syntax in there. It's always important when you do your routes, going in a top-down fashion in your router CFC file, start with the most specific version of the route you're looking for, and then go with the more general ones after that, and go more and more general as you go down the router file. So what's happening here is, in our browser, it tried to run the first route on line 35, but because we have a non-numeric value here for the year placeholder, and line 35 is looking for numeric only, this route doesn't actually get picked up and used like it did in the earlier version of our router example. Instead, Colbox is going to jump down to line 36, and it's going to run this version of the route, which you can see moves the user back to the home page, main.index. So here we can go with numeric specific items, and then we can go with more of a general version of catching any errors or typos on the URL that meant to go to the messages list page, but instead of dealing with those, we can just bounce people to another page, the home page, for instance, or a 404 page if you want to do it that way, whatever works best for your application. But if I go here and I add actual correct data to my browser URL, you can see we get the date that we expect, and we're on the route that we expect to be on in our application as well. Taking the idea of numeric placeholders a step farther, we can actually do that same thing with alpha placeholders. Just like we had the dash numeric syntax here in our route for the messages list page, I can use the dash alpha syntax and look for alphanumeric placeholders in my routes. So this gives us a little bit more flexibility to do the same kind of thing, but rather than looking for just numbers, we can look for combinations of alphanumeric characters. Here I've got a route set up going to /u, which is a shorthand for our users list event. And you can see I have a placeholder after it called user type that's only going to accept alpha characters. Here in my users list handler, I'm simply setting a param defaulting that rc.userType to an empty string. Remember, anything in the route has these placeholders, user type, that will become a variable in the RC scope in our application when this route runs. So over here in our users list event, I'll have RC type coming in if it was provided successfully by the route, and if not, we're just going to default it to an empty string. Then here in my view, I'm simply looking for that rc.userType variable, and if it's there, we're going to draw some text on the screen saying these are the users from the whatever type of team it is we're looking for in our application. So what this lets me do is, instead of typing /users/list/ and then some query string in my app, I can simply do this /u/sales, and you can see it says users from the sales team. If I change that to, let's say, marketing, now it's users from the marketing team. And this is all being done with these alphanumeric routes here in our ColdBox router CFC file. And just like in the numeric version we saw a moment ago, I've also got a more general version of the /u route right below that. So if someone forgets to type in the team name after it, and you just go to /u in your browser, that'll bounce you back to the home page. It's not required that you do this, but it's kind of a nice thing that I put in my router CFC files. That way, there's always a valid route matching whatever the user types in, and they'll get directed to whatever portion of the application it is that I want them to see based on what's in the URL. So now we know how to use numeric placeholders and alpha placeholders in our routers. We can also use regular expression or regex placeholders. They work the same way in that you take your placeholder in your route and you simply add dash and then in this case regex after it as opposed to alpha or numeric. And what that does is it turns on the regular expression pattern matching you can use in your router CFC file. And I simply have that right here after regex. In this case, we're using a very simple regex looking for the values either admin, sales, or marketing. And if any of those were provided in the searching for parameter in our URL, that will match the regex pattern and it will execute this portion of our application for us, the users list event. I'm going to go here to my URL and you can see I have user search/marketing. Marketing is one of the values here in our regular expression that we're looking for. So when I run that, we'll get the searching for users from the marketing team text to appear on the screen. That's happening here in our users list CFC. We've got that default param rc.searching_for. That's the name of the variable being provided by our route. Nothing else in here is new from this version of the event handler. But here over in our view, I've got an if statement where we're simply looking for that RC variable. And if it's available, we draw this text on the screen, similar to how we drew the text for the alpha placeholder a moment ago. I have this text here instead for searching for, and we can use that to draw the searching for text as we see here. I'll change that to something else, let's say sales, and you can see that that works because sales is in our regex, but if I change it to another team that's not listed, let's say customer support, you can see it throws an error because it did not actually match any of the patterns in our regex. So again, I could do something here in my router CFC file if I wanted to have a different sort of regex to match things that are not in that list or provide some sort of missing event handler functionality. There are a number of ways you can handle things that do not match the regex patterns here. It all depends on how you want to configure your application. But you can use regex patterns to do whatever you like. And the nice thing about regex patterns is they are so incredibly powerful. You can get a lot of variety of functionality out of just having a few regexes here in your router CFC file. If you're not familiar with regex, there are a number of great books and resources out on the web. I highly would encourage you to learn more about how to use regex. It's not only valuable just in CFML applications, but they pop up in JavaScript and pretty much any other programming language you're going to come across in your development practices. So regex is a great tool to learn to have that skill available in your development toolbox. If you'd like to learn more about all the different type of pattern placeholders available in your router CFC file, you can look up more information here in the pattern placeholders section under coldbox.ortusbooks.com.